data center is changing, big time. How and where data flows is undergoing a fundamental change, resulting in a multitude of changes in data center architectures. So what are those changes, and how are these new data centers managed? Let's start with the basics. What would you say is the most important architectural trend for those designing or upgrading their data centers?
Hyperconverged. I mean, it's not newest in an industry, but to the majority of customers, hyperconverged is by far the most important trend and the newest trend. I think if you're looking at building out new infrastructure in your data center, building new platforms for next generation applications, if you're not looking at hyperconverged in some form, then you're just building yourself into a problem for the future.
Well, first things that come to mind is software defined. Software defined everything, network and storage, servers. And software defined provides greater visibility, greater transparency, greater manageability, and also helps to better manage the services and data that is going through data centers.
When we talk about next generation data centers, you hear people argue that designers should think like hyperscalers, but most enterprises aren't hyperscalers. They don't have that type of budget, they're not designing their own hardware, and they don't have those volumes of data. But that said, what practical lessons can the enterprise take from the hyperscalers?
So the practical lessons really come from looking at those hyperscalers and saying, okay, well, how can I do that, but in a slightly different way, not quite on the same scale? And so that's exactly what we focus on at VMware. One of the key things is automation. What we're looking at here is, if you're looking at doing things at scale, you're looking at doing things like hyperscalers, they really focus and build automation into everything they do from the very, very start. And then it's looking at doing as much as possible in software. The less you can be tied to a particular hardware gives you the flexibility and the scale. Automate that in software, and suddenly you're starting to get very quickly to the speed, the sort of kinds of economies that your hyperscalers are looking at in the first place.
At the moment, most enterprises aren't building their own data centers, physical data centers that is, but they are building their own data centers in the cloud. And therefore, they're effectively creating small data centers in the hyperscalers, or they're working with those ones that are working at the edge at the same time. The interesting lessons to learn is that really fundamentally the hyperscalers, when they have a problem or something that they can reduce the complexity around, reduce the cost of managing it around, increase the benefits from it, they massively invest into it because they know it's their business. They know that's where they drive revenue as their business. I think enterprise organizations are slowly coming around to the realization that actually in the 21st century, they need to be IT companies themselves, whether they're in industry or healthcare or whatever the industry is. Every company that is more digitally native has an advantage. Therefore, as they build out their own VNets and VPCs and virtual data centers, whether it's on-premise or off-premise, they need to invest into solving those challenges in the same way as the public cloud, instead of spending money to reduce the amount of time they need to spend on that. Because then they're at the behest of vendors and service providers, and they're building their abstraction layer so high up, they're very abstracted from the technology and they have very little control. If you speak to CISOs and CTOs, a lot of them are building out their own DevOps organizations and innovation teams who can now drive that rather than outsourcing it. And I think that's really a step in the right direction.
Actually, the problem that hyperscalers are tackling with is equally relevant and applicable to the enterprise data center. Now, hyperscalers, they have enough money and enough talent and high enough scale to go and combat these issues. So what enterprise can do, they can just take the technology that's being developed there, and actually in some cases it's for sale, sometimes people have free, and just apply in the data center. Every enterprise data center should be run as the cloud data center, more efficiently, more secure.
The next-gen data center houses lots of boxes, lots of cables, and lots of software. And this means lots of stuff to manage. How should you manage a brand new or other next-generation data center? And how important is the management platform?
Massively important. I mean, APIs is the buzzword. Well, it's been a buzzword for a while, but it's really You want to abstract away from the complex underlying infrastructure. That's what public cloud did for us. But you need to do that for not just the compute and the storage, but also the network, which goes across multiple different instances. And to be able to drive it all with APIs and orchestrate it with script-based tools, whether it's Terraform or CloudFormation or whatever tools, Jenkins, Salt, whatever you're using within the organization, it needs to be API based so you can orchestrate across multiple things at the same time. And that's where with NetFoundry we're looking to work with developers so that regardless of whether they're putting applications, they can use APIs to orchestrate their network around their applications and the underlying data centers.
It's a very broad question, and there is you really, what you need to do, you need to have an operating system that manages all the things. Okay, fortunately for enough, this operating system is actually being built on top of network. Application is a network, and building the application is just creating the right network. So the network, the way you manage the resources is to manage the connectivity and the networking in between them. So network management is the key.
Let's talk virtualization. Everything's virtualized now, of course, from networks and servers to entire data centers. But how does virtualization affect data center architectures and data center management?
I think virtualization is what has transformed data centers over the last 20 years. There's absolutely no question of that. I mean, the company that I work for and I'm proud to be part of is built entirely on that change. And so by people realizing they no longer need to be tied to anything physical, initially tied to a physical computer, but now networking, storage, even data centers themselves, what we've done is by virtualization, we've enabled the phenomenon that is the cloud. And customers have really freed themselves up to do things faster and at a bigger scale than ever before without having to worry about any particular piece of hardware, infrastructure, or anything else.
Disaggregation of software and hardware, that's the thing, that's the trend that we see. And it's an interesting trend because it's pushing hardware, typically hardware vendors, to the software field. And but that also brings newcomers to the markets, like startups, for example, and Upstream is a great example of that. So we're gonna see increasing competition, but that will provide the better visibility and better manageability of the data centers.
If you were engaged to build a new data center tomorrow, what's the one thing that you would be sure to do? And what's the one thing you'd be sure not to do?
It would really be working from the ground up to identify how do we build something that we can fully virtualize, fully automate, build around APIs, open source technologies, so that you can create the experience that developers and operations want to use at the same time, because it's two different things, agility and stability. Pulling those both together so that you can provide that ubiquitous experience where they're able to get the most value from the cloud and that data center without the traditional headaches of IT. When I first started in IT, if you wanted to deploy a new application, it was literally a 6 to 9 month process of doing a design, creating a bill of materials, ordering it, have it shipped, having it custom set up. It was mad. What I wouldn't be doing is looking to fit those use cases which used to be very popular. It's almost the axiom of it, but really you can't take that traditional approach anymore unless you sit in a completely regulated market where customers are forced to sit on your cloud. If you're competing for business, it means being able to support businesses in becoming more digital themselves, having more control, being able to have very high agility regardless of where they want to put their applications. That really is the key.
Well, first of all, who am I? Am I an enterprise who wants own data center, or am I a co-location provider or even hyperscaler maybe, right? So if I'm enterprise, what type of applications I will be running? And that will define the architecture of my data center. If I'm a co-location provider, then who are my customers? Are they retail companies, or are they manufacturing companies? That's a completely different areas, right? And when we talk about financials, that will be different too. Increased security requirements for those guys. Healthcare, security, how do I deal with that? Regulations. So that all plays a very important role. What I definitely wouldn't do is to run to the first store and buy newly highly speeds flash arrays just to make it shiny and attractive.
Okay, first of all, I would sure to think about the solution at data center level down and not from individual boxes up. And what I would do is to make sure that I understand what are the services and what are the components that are needed and how to create a clear interfaces, either standard or I can make them standard and build the lower level up. When you build it from bottom up, you will build on the standard technologies and not invent your own tricky things down there on the electronics.
With so much data moving into the cloud, what's the future of the on-prem enterprise data center?
So on-premises data centers are not going away. At VMware, we were always, I've been saying it's hybrid cloud forever, and people always used to say, oh, you're only saying that because you sell on-premises. I mean, we public cloud, private cloud, what we sell is choice. So on-premises are not going away. I think the future for them is they will be where people put workloads that maybe they found are too expensive to run in certain public clouds. We're certainly seeing that trend, people bringing things back to on-premises. But I think it's where things are going to sit that have a need to not be in the public cloud. It might be legal reasons, there might be latency reasons, there might be a lot of different reasons why public cloud or not in your data center is not the answer. So I don't think it's going away, but I think what it'll look like will be different. It'll, as I say, be more modular, faster, easier to manage, much more efficient to run.
Well, 2030 is what, 11 years from now, right? And it's very difficult to predict, because when we talk about the 11 years before, then it's a completely different world, right? It's 3G, it's IoT, what is that? We have only BYOD and we just heard about that. So, but I think that it will be changing, and some verticals, for government, for example, or financials, they will be still using some type of on-prem based data centers. The same as manufacturing. For example, we see the trend from going from the mega data centers to the localized or situated near the endpoints. And it's on-prem, right? It's managed through the cloud, but this is the box, basically, the container that stands on-prem and runs the data analysis.
So it seems that the next-gen data center will be fundamentally different from its predecessor. It'll be more flexible, easier to manage, and it'll be data-centric. Hopefully, it'll be more secure too. Time will tell how that pans out.